Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our conference. We keep our agenda moving forward, and I'm more than sure that many of you have been looking forward to the event I will now have an honor to announce. Religion and integral human development on the global level. This topic definitely resonates in the thought of each of us, regardless the country of origin, social or economic status. I will have a great honor to announce a moderator of the interview with Katherine Marshall, a valued friend of Ukrainian Catholic University, Professor José Casanova, Senior Fellow at Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Professor Casanova, I warmly welcome you to virtual Ukrainian Catholic University and now give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's good afternoon here in the East Coast, where Katherine and I are also separated, but and it's good evening for all of you in Ukraine. It's a great pleasure to participate in this conference. As you may know, I am a member of the advisory board of the International Institute for Ethics and Contemporary Issues, which has been sponsoring, organizing these conferences on integral human development in the digital age. And of course, we didn't know that we will have to go digitally. And so here we are digitally, all of us, to discuss development today, particularly development at the global level. And I have the honor and the pleasure to have as the interviewed or the conversationalist, my dear friend and my fellow also at the Berkley Center, Katherine Marshall. Katherine, welcome. Katherine also has visited UKU.
I'm delighted to be with you. Wish I were in Ukraine, but the good news from Washington, D.C. is that there are signs of spring and the sun is out. So,
well, we still have a lot of snow here. I'm in Montclair, New Jersey, but yes, it's almost. Katherine, you are the executive director of the World Faith Development Dialogue. You work for 36 years in the World Bank, precisely first on all kinds of issues of development throughout the world, particularly in the poorest countries in the world, in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And then your last year, for 6 years, you led the Faith and Ethics Initiative. I assume this is what led you then to help create the World Faiths Development Dialogue. So tell us about what it is, this World Faiths Development Dialogue that you are leading.
In 1998, in other words, quite a bit before a major event that shifted people's thinking about the role of religion in world affairs, which was 9/11 and some of the other associated events. The president of the World Bank at the time, Jim Wolfenson, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, along with Monsignor Etchegaray from the Vatican, Prince Talal, the Aga Khan, came together with the idea that there was a very large missing piece in global approaches to international development, which was religion. That to this day, I don't think that the World Bank in its library has a category for religion. But that's true of most of the UN agencies, that even if they dealt with organizations, it was simply not on the formal agenda. But because of particularly such roles in health and education, Wolfenson, Lord Kerry, and others decided that there needed to be a dialogue, and I was asked to help in turning what had been an idea into something much more practical. I will continue for a minute here, which is because the story is an interesting one, that it seemed something particularly a good idea, but that was also uncontroversial, which was to have a dialogue. But in practice, what happened is that there was almost unanimous opposition from the 193 member countries that were part of the World Bank board. Actually, it was 184 only in the World Bank at that time. And we spent a great deal of time trying to understand what the objections were. And they had a lot to do with the political roles of religious institutions. The sense, because the World Bank's mandate is to avoid being directly involved in politics. But it was also two other things. One was the sense that religion was no longer very important, which we all know now not to be true. But the other was the view that many religious institutions were against some fundamental aspects, some fundamental issues on the development agenda, which were, to a large extent, of course, human rights. But above all, nothing was more prominent in those early discussions than gender roles and the role of women, where religious institutions had the reputation of being very patriarchal and of not appreciating the significance of equality for women. So to fast forward very quickly, because of this controversy, I was drawn deeper and deeper into an issue which was not my area, which I had not known much about, became fascinated by it, became fascinated by the people. And when Wolfensohn left the bank, I moved to Georgetown University to the Berkley Center, which was just being established.
Well, now you are recognized as the world expert on faith and development. So after working for 20 years in this area, almost shaping the field through your initiatives, how are faith and development related? Positively, negatively, what is the relationship and why it's so important to consider the relationship at different levels?
Well, first of all, the relationship is clearly important because both the sort of vast world of religious institutions, but also the complex global agenda, which is epitomized in the Sustainable Development Goals, are enormously significant for the world's population, not just for the poor. But to answer your question a bit more directly, I think we always need to appreciate that the religious worlds, which are very diverse, can be part of the problem. In other words, they can be an obstacle. And I think the most dramatic case is religiously inspired or colored conflicts in the world, but also some others that I mentioned before. But that religious institutions are also, in so many different ways, a part of the solution, with many different factors involved, including direct service delivery, for example, the universities and the schools that are run by religious institutions. In the COVID crisis, we're acutely conscious of the health roles at many different levels, and the peace building, the peacekeeping roles of religious institutions. And so the whole broad development agenda is missing very important pieces when both the development and the religious actors are not at the table when decisions are made.
Right. So we've mentioned health, education, gender. We'll come to each of these points. But let's first try to see how is, because, as you know, this conference is about integral human development. Usually it's taken as the personal human development. Obviously, you work at the societal level of development. How are these two parts of the puzzle, the personal integral human development and societal integral development related, and why it's important to look at both aspects of the relationship?
Well, let me start with one of the important concepts in thinking in a more sophisticated, nuanced way about what development means. And that is what's called the capabilities report approach, which is to develop each individual's capacities, to give them the freedom, but also the support to develop through education or through many other aspects their capabilities. So I think that that's one piece of it. So that's one. A second, which I'm teaching at the moment, a class on ethics and development. And one of the critical issues is, what is the motivation for people to support others? And part of the fascinating history is that in most of the past eras, charity was as much for the benefit of the giver to improve their chance of a life after death, but also to improve their character, because there was very little thought that it was possible to end poverty. The idea that you could actually end poverty is quite a modern and a new idea. So I think that this idea of shifting from an approach of charity to one that is founded in rights and the sense that every individual has the right to develop their capabilities is where you make this link between the personal compassion and sense of being a part of a human family to a new sense, which is really post-World War II, which is that it is both possible, and because it's possible, it is critically important to do something to end avoidable suffering and therefore extreme poverty.
But also avoidable diseases. You've worked for many years precisely on the health front. And also it was not thought that it would be possible to end all kinds of diseases that have basically burdened humanity for centuries. Malaria, all kinds of other. And this issue of pandemics. You've worked on issue of pandemics before. You work on the Ebola pandemic in Africa. What lessons have you learned from it? And what is new about the COVID-19? What is the relationship and why are we in a different world? What is going on? What is happening?
Now, that's a great question and also a complicated one. In many ways, and for various reasons, health was sort of the entry point. When you try to persuade someone who doesn't think much about religion or who even might be hostile to religion, that they should be paying attention, health is the most obvious. And that's, first of all, because religious institutions run significant parts of the healthcare systems. The Catholic Church, for example, has many hospitals and clinics. That's true especially in Africa, but in other parts of the world as well. But also the factors that are prevention of disease, that affect prevention of disease, that are the community support, for example, for tuberculosis, have to do with religious beliefs and with the community pressures. This came to a head, particularly with the HIV/AIDS crisis, because in many ways, in the early years, when it was seen as a disease of homosexuals above all, many religious institutions railed against the action on HIV/AIDS, which they saw as a disease of immorality. But at the same time, communities that cared for people were among the most compassionate in the world, who cared for children who were dying, who cared for people who were dying. So you had, on the one hand, priests who would refuse to bury someone who died of AIDS in the churchyard, encouraging stigma, and on the other, the growth of an enormous movement of compassion. So all of a sudden, there was a new awareness that these communities needed to be together and to work together. Now, with the Ebola crisis, you had very similar phenomena that in the beginning, the public health specialists didn't pay much attention to the churches. But then they realized first that in terms of communications, the churches had, and the mosques had enormous power to communicate, whether through social media or through sermons or whatever. And they also had more trust from communities than other sectors. And this came to a head in the Ebola crisis, when it was understood that a lot of the transmission of Ebola was taking place through funerals and people handling bodies, when in fact they were the most infectious. And finally, they realized people were digging bodies up or hiding their dead because they did not like the idea of people carting them away and cremating the bodies or burying them in an undignified way. So you had the World Health Organization and a number of others that came together and came up with a protocol on dignified burial and respectful burials, which many described as a game changer. In other words, one that really brought the communities together. Now, you asked about the COVID crisis. Because of this past experience, very early in the crisis, in early March, we were reading even about some cases where religious communities were blamed for being a super spreader, were clearly involved. The churches in Korea, but the Tablighi Jamaat, Muslim communities had large gatherings where a lot of people got sick. So we decided to track exactly what was happening with the COVID crisis, of how religious communities were responding in different parts of the world. And that has led us to a year-long project. We're about to celebrate the first, I don't know if celebrate is the right word, we're about to mark the first anniversary of the gathering of a very large repository of information. We've sent out daily or weekly reports. We've held a number of webinars. We had a webinar last night that was focused on the challenges of the vaccination campaigns, where there are many ethical issues and where religious communities are understood to be a pivotal part of society that will determine whether or not the global vaccination campaign is successful.
Let's go back to the question of gender. You've also been very much for a long time involved as an advocate for the need to take very seriously the questions of gender inequality, which are so related to questions of all kinds of inequality and development, also faith. So why is gender so important in this whole area of integral human development, faith and development, and simply development?
Well, in your kind introduction of my bio, it's clear that I've been around for a long time. And therefore, I have been part of what is a sea change in thinking about relationships between men and women that includes the international development field. When I started, there were almost no women, except in secretarial positions where they were all of the people who were involved. And it took some time in many different institutions. It really went institution by institution for there to be a recognition that women should be, first of all, part of the people who were working on development, and secondly, that there needed to be an explicit focus on the welfare of women in development programs. And what really changed the thinking was, and it's a very interesting example, was research about the benefits of education of girls. This research demonstrated that there were remarkable improvements in welfare of the society at large when a significant number of girls were educated. And you could even measure it. One of my favorite examples was that there is a correlation between a woman's level of education and her child's head size, which is explained largely by education encouraging better nutrition. But this is true in looking at income, looking at family welfare, looking at the outcome for children, and so forth. So within the development field, no respectable institution now would not have gender equality as one of their central objectives. And of course, you point to the fact that there are many other inequalities, but gender is really the largest group, because we're talking about more than half the world's population in societies which traditionally have been quite patriarchal. So that brings me to the question of religious institutions, because clearly within the development field, maybe behavior doesn't always follow what are the announced ideals and principles of equality and equity. But in religious institutions, there are many traditions that are deeply ingrained that really are unequal between men and women, with the most obvious one, whether or not they can be ordained members of a clergy or religious leaders, but also many others that extend to relationships within families. The way that people think about domestic violence, for example, the way that they view decision-making. So clearly, there are some religious traditions which have been on the leadership in the world on women's equality, but there are many others that have not. And that has been a major obstacle, so that when you see a photograph of a group of religious leaders who are all men and who are all older, many people in the development sphere will simply say, why should we pay attention to groups that do not accept what is a central premise of what makes for successful development?
Since we are in Ukraine, and particularly in Galicia, in Halechina, let me, of course, this is the stronghold of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. This is, of course, UKU is a Ukrainian Catholic university. It doesn't have married women, but it had married priests. And the wives of the priests and the daughters of the priests. I mean, the priests were the leaders of the community on issues of development, of education, literacy, health. But the women, the wives of the priests and the daughters were also at the forefront of social issues development in Galicia in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is crucial because, of course, they play the role of leadership. Men, and this is an issue also precisely when we talk of religion. We should not only consider precisely the hierarchy of male, let's say, religious leaders, but at the local level, women play a crucial role in religious community development. So because of that, it's also very important not to only, if you wish, go to the high level of the hierarchies, but especially at the local level where women are so much involved also in both development, education, religious issues.
Yeah, we tend to speak now of religious actors. And when you say religious actors, you are looking to women who may play very informal leadership roles as well as ones who are designated. But again, as you're, I think, highlighting, often religious beliefs are more firmly held by women than by men. That is something that many surveys have showed. And of course, they play critical roles in passing on the values and the ethics that are embedded in religious traditions to their children.
And of course, in the Catholic tradition, since we are in this midst, female religious sisters have played a crucial role both in education, in health. I mean, hospitals of the Catholic Church, all the schools at all levels, women have played a crucial role and still do. You mentioned before dignified burials. One of the, of course, of the, if you wish, hard lessons of COVID has been the impossibility of families coming together to bury their loved ones. There are other issues that COVID-19 has affected social relations. There are a lot of paradoxes. On the one hand, it has made evident the fundamental divide between the knowledge class and the no-knowledge class. All of us that can work with computers, that can work basically with the digital age, have been affected, but not so much by the COVID. On the other hand, it is the people who actually do not work in these communications, the knowledge class that work, if you wish, with their bodies, with their hands that are needed, the essential workers. Many of them are women. So you have, on the one hand, the knowledge class that have been least affected by COVID. They may even have gained financially because they have not been spending money and they have not lost their jobs. But both women have been disproportionately affected because both many of them are essential workers, but also because they were precisely in the service industries that have been most affected by COVID and they lost their jobs. So throughout the world, we see that actually the advantages that women have made in terms of wages and careers are again probably suffering and are going to suffer for the foreseeable future. So what is the lesson? What it is that we must do to make sure that somehow out of COVID we get these lessons to make sure that somehow we can correct these imbalances?
Well, I think one of the first lessons from the COVID crisis is that it has made starkly obvious the inequalities in the world between countries, within countries, between genders, between classes, between ethnic groups, religious communities. They were well known before, but they've been first accelerated, secondly accentuated, and third made much more visible by the COVID crisis. So the metaphor that's often used is that we're all in the same boat, the sense that the world is suffering from the same crisis, that no one escapes, there are no borders. And yet, if you use that analogy of a storm, that we're in a storm, first of all, the storm is hitting different countries at different times and with different force. Some are much, much more affected than others. But also people are not in the same boat. They're clearly not in the same boat. They're in different boats. So some are in a huge yacht or an ocean liner, whereas others are in a tiny craft or hanging on to driftwood. So that analogy, I think, it enriches exactly what you were saying, that it's affecting different people. So there's a lot of thinking. We all know from history that crises shape what happens, shape the path of history. And it can shape it in negative ways. It can reinforce prejudices. It can reinforce class divides, but in positive directions. So that's where the idea of building back better, build back greener, build back fairer, all of these ideas are very much in play. And I think it depends on all of you and all of us, whether people just simply try to go back to normal, accepting that they've lost 10 years or 20 years of progress, or whether there is a sincere, thoughtful, far-reaching effort to address the problems of inequality that have been revealed by the COVID crisis.
But of course, the problem is that on the one hand, exactly the paradox, we are ever more aware of interdependence. COVID has made clear that indeed we are not only in it together, but there can be real no borders because the virus does not respect any border. And yet the reaction usually has been the knee-jerk reaction to close borders, to think of it in terms of our nation, our. And we see it with the vaccines. and how the wealthiest countries have basically hoarded until now the vaccines. They have already bought all of them. And so the question is, what can we do to develop a kind of a global system of response to this global crisis, which takes more into account the fact that there should be a little more fairness and equity in solving these solutions for everybody, not just for the wealthiest nations or for the most educated classes?
Well, I wouldn't put up with a little more. I think there needs to be a lot more. And again, I think it does come back to the ways in which religious leadership, and I'm using that term broadly, can help people to translate a general goodwill, desire to work together into something much more practical. The vaccine example is a stark example right now where people are talking about vaccine nationalism. And it does reflect a very human tendency to take care of oneself and one's people close to you first, and then to look to the rest of the world. So I don't think that that's something we can ignore, nor is it something that will be easily overcome. But there are also extensive and very creative efforts, first of all, to bring it to people's attention. The head of the World Health Organization calls this vaccine nationalism and the inequities a moral catastrophe. And other leaders, religious and non-religious, have come together to say that. But perhaps even more important, there are, with COVAX and with other efforts, there are genuine efforts to correct the balance quickly. And it is using, as usual, the tactic of fear. So telling people, look, if people across the world do not have the vaccine, we aren't going to be out of the crisis. But also they're altruistic, they're better angels, so that they have some better appreciation that this is not something that's something nice to do, but that is something that's absolutely critical to our common welfare, to the common good.
Besides your own World Faiths Development Dialogue, you also serve as Vice President of the G20 Interfaith Association. You've also worked on interfaith relations, organizations dialogue for many, many years. In moments like that, all the work that has been done, how can be put to good use? Tell us about the next G20 and what are you preparing, and how is this interfaith association precisely contributing to raise issues, to look for solutions? What is being done?
Well, you mentioned in the beginning that the effort in 1998-99 was something very new, to bring together in dialogue, but also common action, the best of religion and the best of development, but also to deal with the challenges and the problems. The G20 Interfaith Forum is a very interesting, relatively new effort, though ever since the G7 and the G8 developed, there have been efforts to do something that we all talk about, which is to have the religious voices at. And we often say, if you're not at the table, you end up at the menu. So then you have to ask which tables. So there are discussions within the United Nations, within UNICEF, within World Food Program, within the Refugee Organization, et cetera, to answer the question of where should religious actors be as part of the discussion. The G20 Interfaith is, the G20 itself was born out of crisis management. It was born in 2008 and with the financial crisis. And it has developed since It's a smaller group than the United Nations, clearly. It's 20, but there are always a few other actors who are involved. It's potentially much more nimble than, it doesn't have procedures. It doesn't have even a secretariat, permanent secretariat. And the leadership of the G20 moves from country to country. So that this year, the host and therefore setting the agenda is Italy. Last year it was Saudi Arabia, the year before Japan, the year before Argentina, and next year it will be Indonesia and India the year afterwards. So it is the host country that sets the agenda. And the objective of the G20 Interfaith has been not only to move your elbows and say, we need a seat at the table because we're important and you should pay attention, but to come with specific ideas and specific proposals that respond to the agenda of the G20 leaders, but that also represent what religious actors care about. So one of the latter issues is clearly the question of religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief. But then you have to say, well, what do you want the G20 leaders to do? Last year and this year, inevitably, the COVID crisis is the central part of the agenda. And so the recommendations last year, which in the meeting that took place in October, focused very much on the COVID response in a couple of ways. One of them was pointing out that the vaccine issue will not be addressed, will not be resolved without engagement of religious communities, both positively, but also to deal with hesitation and misinformation, which we can come back to if you wish. But also 1.6 billion children have been out of school, and many of them are still out of school. And again, religious actors play major roles in education, but they also can do, and comes back to what we were talking about before, having more of a sense of the purpose of education and dealing with issues of quality and issues of how can education systems deal with the polarization that the world faces. How can they help in building the kinds of trust and social cohesion that are so critical for successful societies? So the G20 is a part of the very complicated, shifting set of multilateral institutions, global institutions. It has a very special role, and that's why I've been putting a lot of effort into trying to build the interreligious part of the G20 forum so that it is a major partner along with, by the way, the W20, which is women, the T20 think tanks, B20, which is business, and so forth.
Now, this year is in Italy. Italy, of course, is the home of the Pope. This Pope has been very articulate in elaborating on all kinds of crucial global issues. Fratelli Tutti basically is an attempt to reflect morally, but also practically what is to be done on the pandemic and how it affects all issues of global governance, of global fairness, justice, the environment, inequality, etc. Do you expect that the Catholic Church will be very, very much involved in the G20 meeting in Italy to a certain extent?
The Catholic Church is very deeply involved and has been for some years, but it will be particularly this year in the G20 Interfaith Forum. It will be held in Bologna, and one of the partners is Cardinal Zuppi, who is very much involved with a number of institutions, but clearly senior leaders of the Vatican, perhaps even the most senior, we hope will participate. And you were referring to the Vatican Commission that was established almost a year ago, that is doing some of the most interesting analytic work on the COVID crisis, including some issues that are very much on the G20 agenda, which is debt restructuring, both the processes and immediate action, dealing with the idea of the SDR to try to make far more resources available to poor countries. But it's looking at universal basic income proposals, looking at food issues, the fact that some people refer to HOVID as opposed to COVID, meaning hunger, which is one of the horrible side effects of the shutdowns that have been necessary to try to contain the COVID pandemic. So the involvement and the cooperation with in all religious communities, but obviously with Italy, the Vatican will be especially involved. And I want to mention one other issue. This year, the G20 agenda set by Italy is peace, planet, prosperity. So, sorry, people, planet, prosperity. So the people
okay.
is that was last year, and it is one of 5 P's. The 2 that are not on the agenda this year are peace and partnership. But they will implicitly be there. But the idea is to focus very much on education and health, and that's and for the G20 Interfaith, it's healing, but it is also planet. And that's the point I'm making here, that with the COP 26 in Glasgow, it is the UK and Italy that are the key partners on bringing, in many ways, post-COVID, a very practical and demanding agenda for environmental protection, dealing with climate change, back onto the agenda. And of course, the complexity is that everything is related to everything else. So planet is related to COVID, COVID is related to planet, is related to education, is related to conflict and peace, and so forth.
And of course, you use the word healing, which in most languages serve for both, for health and for salvation. Salus in Latin means both salvation and health. And obviously, they are very much interrelated. I assume that there is competition among the religions when it comes to precisely who is the best healer. On the other hand, or who brings more salvation. On the other hand, I assume they can work better together, more fruitfully, when they can, on the practical level of what is to be done together for the common good of humanity. So I assume that also this involvement of the faiths in the development field is one of the most fruitful ways of advancing interreligious dialogue and cooperation.
That's right. Yeah, and one of the things that we've been monitoring in the COVID crisis has been the ways in which religious communities have responded. And we referred earlier to some of gathering, of funerals, of celebration, of marriage, even of pastoral care of people who are traumatized with so many problems of mental health that we're facing. So a lot of practices have changed. The digital issue is one. But perhaps even more important is the ways in which religious communities have responded in communities all over the world to help people who are homeless, people who are evicted, people who are hungry, people who've lost their jobs, children who are suffering, child abuse, domestic abuse. So that is one of the main areas we're tracking. And it's interesting that it's something I don't think we will ever know fully, what the response of religious communities has been. Even looking, for example, at the Washington, D.C. area. I'm sure it's true in Ukraine as well, that there are just countless efforts of soup kitchens, of personal outreach and care. And the Religions for Peace, which is a major global interreligious organization, has made has a special fund to encourage interfaith cooperation. I often think that cooperation between religious and secular is more difficult than interreligious cooperation. that the language may be more different. There may be a greater history of tensions. But it is this issue of partnership, of finding ways to break down the silos, is part of what I think we also know is one of the critical issues we all face, which is polarization and the levels of anger and fear that are driving some of the tensions in the world.
I would like to encourage all the audience, if you have any question for Katherine, please write it down in the chat, and so that you have the opportunity also to raise whichever issue you want to raise. Now, let's talk about the role of our center, or the work you do in the Berkley Center. You've worked in many, many countries around the world. Just give us some idea of the kind of work you do precisely at the level of linking the knowledge from the university, grassroots level of organization, gathering information, the basic information. So what it is that your center does precisely at this level?
Well, one of the issues that we're grappling with is what we call faith literacy, which is that many people who are in decision-making positions really know very little about religious work. And they may not even know very much about their own tradition that they were raised in, but when it comes to others, there are many gaps and many misunderstandings. But you could also say the same in many religious institutions, that their development literacy is not very high. So a lot of what we do is essentially communication, and that means finding examples which are not only good, but also bad examples, and working on that. We also are dealing, and this seems to be a theme, with a lot of misunderstandings. So I, for example, find talking about religion too broad, because there are so many very, very different traditions that when you say religion or even people of faith, I think that it can be very distorting, particularly when the implication is negative, as in women, that religion does not support women's equality, for example, I think is a misnomer. It's not true. But we also, first of all, do some very practical projects, and I'll come back to that. But we also are very convinced that the situations of different countries and communities vary widely, and that if you do not have a country-focused or community-focused approach, you live at the level of generalities, 30,000 feet, where you can talk about common good or whatever, but it doesn't translate into a school curriculum or into reaching most vulnerable communities with healthcare, or dealing with land tenure issues that are preventing agricultural development or water supply or sanitation, which is one of the worst performing of the global development goals. So we've done for 10 countries a review where we look at the development agenda and we look at the religious agenda, and then see where they mesh and where they don't mesh. And I think we've even had a conversation, José, about the possibility of doing something like this for Ukraine, but have not, so far at least, been able to move beyond that. We also have worked a lot on projects. So we're working in Senegal and Guinea, for example, on family welfare, which means partly family planning, but it's shifted. The focus has shifted to COVID because that is the issue right now. In Southeast Asia, we're working on translating, on linking the freedom of religion or belief with peace building, because so many of the conflicts have both a religious as well as an ethnic and a class dimension to them. In South Asia, the project we're working on that I was on a meeting this morning is COVID related, and it is specifically dealing with communication. It's an European Union finance project that is trying to craft and to communicate positive and informative, scientifically based messages about COVID, but also to follow and to respond to some of the misinformation, which may be unintentional, but which may also be intentional, designed to fuel tension among groups.
I mean, you mentioned Ukraine. Usually most of the work you've done is on the global south, but the issues of development in post-Soviet societies are unique. They are different. They are different from those in the global south, but there are also very serious problems of the health system, different types of inequalities, different types also of misinformation, misunderstandings. From the little you know, or from your visits, which aspects of integral human development are, you think, most critical or most needed, let's say, if you look at post-Soviet societies? You also work on issues of corruption, for instance. You work in the very much on issues of corruption. So just some reflections for Ukraine.
The first comment is that some time ago, maybe 7 or 8 decades ago, it was reasonable to think of the world as divided into two parts, the rich and the poor. That simply is not true. And so many organizations are trying not to use the word developing. And I find often the global south is quite distorted because the world is a much more complex place. You're totally right that from 1989, 1990, when the former Soviet Union countries came much more into the development sphere with the creation of the European Development Bank, for example, but also major programs. It was a whole new category of transition economies. And I think one of there are various issues that have been very important. One of them clearly is thinking about the role of the private sector and of entrepreneurship as a major issue. The issue of corruption is not confined to any group of countries. And one of the frustrations that I have in an area that I've been working on is that in the major global integrity alliances, and I'd put Transparency International as a very dynamic and important civil society organization, there has been very, very little religious participation, particularly at the global level. There has been in some countries. And there's a good reason for that, which is that if you treat corruption purely as a moral issue of people's failings, you can't really deal with the problem, which is an institutional, structural problem. But there's now a recognition that without dealing with those complex ethical issues, which inevitably involves the religious traditions as well as non-religious, it's very difficult to see a path forward. But clearly the issue of corruption, which is, as I said, sadly a universal one, is a major obstacle to development programs. It erodes trust, and it wastes resources, and it blocks the kinds of progress that we know is possible. And I come back to the point I said before, that we have a very different situation where we know that it is possible for every person who's born to have the opportunity for a decent life, which was never true in the past, where large percentages of people lived their lives never moving from where they were and with almost no opportunity, almost in servitude or slavery. But the chance today to see the transformation of societies is real. And at least in my view, it puts a common responsibility to make that ideal, that possibility, a reality.
Again, I want to encourage anybody. We have 5 more minutes. If you want to raise any question, let me basically, let's go back to the question of education and what our institutions can do precisely in all these kind of issues. On the one hand, also, it has been one of the most affected areas, children again, but also young people that need particularly to be together for their own development. So to a certain extent, can we rely on, what are the lessons? Can we rely on digital communication for integral human development, for real education, or do we still need ultimately human being together, real bodily relationships that basically make so tangible the fact that we are related and we are interdependent and not only mediated through media?
I think most observers and most participants actually would say that things will never go back to exactly the way they were before the COVID crisis. If it had lasted 3 weeks, we might have talked about simply returning to normal. But it's clear that negatively, but also positively, there's a major transformation, a disruption. And I think that the digital has negative but also positive sides. It makes this kind of an encounter that we're having possible. So I think the sense that we need to learn from the positives as well as the negatives from the COVID crisis is important. One of the most interesting aspects of the G20 Interfaith Forum working is focusing on education. And it is working to bring some of the best experience that will be both global, both cross-boundary, but also very local, in giving teachers more equipment to deal with some of the less mechanical parts of education, the social cohesion, the civic values, the understandings of other religions, the basic religious literacy. So that exercise is doing some very interesting work. But it is striking that there are some very different discourses within the international development world. If people ask, what is the priority? What is your absolute priority? A very common answer will be education first, education second, and education third, with a sense that no society can really be successful, however you're defining it, without quality education. Quality is actually a very important term because there are major concerns about the poor quality of education and learning in many parts of the world. But in religious communities, you often sense an unease with this, where people are more concerned with the values that education is transmitting than with numeracy and with knowledge. So I think my sense, which it goes beyond your question, is that there is a need for a dialogue which takes these quite different perspectives into account as we look to rebuild education systems in the future.
Well, I'm very glad that we can communicate digitally, but I certainly miss going down the hall and seeing your office open and just coming in and just sitting and just talking about all kinds of things. Thank you so much. It has been great having you, Katherine. Is there anybody that would like to raise the final question? Well, then if not, again, you have the last word, Katherine.
Well, thank you very much. I wish I could be with you, José, but also with all of you who are listening. It's a very disembodied experience not to even see your faces on the screen. I've been following part of the conference and finding it extremely interesting and look forward. I was teaching this morning, so I missed some things to listening to it, to the recordings. So thank you so much and hope to see you in person as soon as possible.
Well, and tomorrow we'll see Katherine again, and me. We will be at the panel at Georgetown together with Kim Daniels and David Hollenbach, again continuing this conversation. So thank you so much to everybody, and until next time.
Yes. Dear friends, our esteemed virtual audience, I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Thank you very much, both Professor Marshall, Professor Casanova, for this fascinating discussion and for the very, very rich takeaways from this deliberation. It was a great honor to have, such well-known experts in this field together with us today. Thank you so much.